Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another SEDC digital event. I'm Gene Stinson, your president. I'd like to welcome everyone here today. When we started this process about a little over a month ago, we did it as a result, obviously, of these difficult times that we're all in. And when we sent out a survey to the membership, we were asking questions regarding along the lines of what type of information could we share with you from a standpoint of better preparing you as an economic development practitioner. One of those areas that came back was in the area of strategic planning. You know, how do we plan going forward under these circumstances because things are going to be different. So this is one that we had a couple of very strong members that were willing and able and agreed to participate and serve as our host for this webinar. Earlier today, Matthew sent out to everyone a few kind of housekeeping items just to better inform you about the webinar itself. I just want to kind of go over those as a reminder. You are an active participant in this webinar. However, you cannot communicate by voice with the hosts, the participants, but you can ask questions. At the bottom, if you scroll over with your mouse, at the very bottom of your screen, up will pop the Q&A button. You can simply open that, type in a question, and between Bill and Jim and myself, we will monitor that and make sure that your question gets responded to. Also, Matthew sent out the slides that Bill and Jim will be working from today. And then finally, if you want to go back and at any time in the future review the presentation, this recorded event will be online on our YouTube channel. So let's get started. Some quick introductions for our panelists. First up, we have Bill Murphy. Bill is a Senior VP of Economic Development for the Tulsa Regional Chamber, where he leads a team of professionals to execute the Tulsa's Future Program, the region's economic development strategy. He has over 20 years experience in economic development and has worked on projects totaling nearly $2 billion in the states of Ohio, Georgia, and Oklahoma. He is a graduate of Wright State University, earning a BA in Political Science in '91 and a Master's of Urban and Public Administration in 1998. He's a certified economic developer and also an economic development finance professional. Bill is a member of the Oklahoma Governor's Economic Development Marketing Team, a board member of the Oklahoma Economic Development Council, and also an SEDC board member representing the state of Oklahoma. Next, we have up Jim Fram. Jim has had 30+ years of successful economic development and senior level Chamber of Commerce management experience in Little Rock, Bartlesville, Oklahoma, Killian Fort Hood, Texas, Lincoln, Nebraska, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and most recently Hot Springs, Arkansas, capping a highly successful career that began in Harrison, Arkansas in the early 1980s. In January of 2018, Jim fulfilled a longtime dream and founded Community Growth Strategies, LLC, a consulting firm that focuses on communities as well as regional economic development efforts. He is a certified economic developer also and a certified chamber executive. He is a past board member and an honorary life member of SEDC as well. So, Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you get us started. Thanks again, guys, for being on today.
Thank you, Gene, and thank all of you for taking time out of your busy day to take part in this effort. Hopefully we won't be too over simple in our presentation. We're going to try to give you some basics on strategic planning and developing a strategic plan, and then try to talk maybe about strategic planning as we emerge from the current pandemic crisis that we're in. As an economic developer, you're tasked with making some huge decisions. Are you putting your community on the right path? Might be a question that you ask yourself quite often. Having a strategic plan is essential to the success of this, and the key elements of the plan include a vision, mission statements, detailed goals and objectives, and probably what I think is the most important part, the action plan or tactics of your strategic plan. And then we'll talk a little bit about scorecards to help you track your community's process. Some organizations and some communities even add maybe a values statement to some of those elements. Make sure you include each of these key components to create a strategic plan to serve your organization. Including these detailed sections will help you and will help your team stay on the same page and understand what you want to accomplish. Properly designed or properly put together strategic plan is not only thorough, but it helps ensure each section comes together, creates a cohesive document to support you in leading your organization. So slide one, we're going to talk about vision. And when you think of a vision statement, think of what your organization looks like in an ideal situation. What would your community be doing if it were operating in a perfect environment? What goals do you want your organization to accomplish that may seem far-fetched, but still be achievable? These may also be referred to as stretch goals. These are big questions, but the vision statement's important to strategic planning, because it tells you and your board and your team and your constituents the direction which you're headed. You can go to several economic development organization websites across the country. You can Google these and go to those websites and get some good examples of vision statements that some other communities have done. I'm going to share a couple of with you here. One of these is very detailed, and the second one is very brief. So it's two vision statements that are almost at opposite ends of the scale. The first one is Des Moines is an economically self-sustaining community that maximizes the potential of its natural assets. Development is encouraged to support healthy commercial areas and city services. Successful local business districts are attractive destinations for residents as well as visitors. Developed areas incorporate green space, public art, residential density, and visitor appeal, and draw people to work, shop, stay, and play in Des Moines. That's a lot of detail to go into a vision statement, but it talks about the way I described that in the beginning. The next one is very straight and to the point, and probably the opposite of the one I just read. And it reads, to foster a vibrant, prosperous, and growing Fort Wayne through extraordinary community development. From these examples of vision statements that are simple and to the point and yet convey the point of view and depth of information, you get a sense of what your organization stands for, what you aim to be, and what your strategy is. To write a good vision statement, you need to think about the impact that you want your organization to have on your customers, on your constituents, on your society, on anybody that's going to be viewing this either in print or on your website. And you want people to think of this when they see your community's name. The next thing we're going to transition to is the next slide is the mission statement itself. A mission statement is like a vision statement, but it gets more specific in the details on the actions. The mission statement will detail what your organization does. It explains to people outside your community why you exist. And again, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of mission statements. And again, I would advise you to Google some economic development organizations across the country and take a look at some of these. You'll see different ones all over the map, but you'll find one that maybe you can use as a model that kind of fits your organization and fits your geography. Here's a couple of examples of mission statements. To develop and implement creative community-based strategies to enhance economic opportunity, build strong neighborhoods, and ensure a dynamic framework for quality growth and development. Another one is Big Sky Development's mission is to sustain and grow our region's vibrant economy and outstanding quality of life by providing leadership and resources for business creation, expansion, retention, new business recruitment, and community development. In some cases, you can even mention specific products or services in your mission statement that maybe you have that would separate you from other organizations that somebody may be looking at. In other cases, you can describe an issue that your organization are passionate about fixing, maybe that redevelopment area in one part of your community. After reading each of these examples, I hope you're better able to understand what each organization does and why it exists. When you're creating mission statements, it's important that you put yourself in your customer or your client or your constituent's shoes. Craft your mission statement so that a customer or a client can understand what your organization does and why. Think about why you started your organization in the first place, why it exists, and use that reasoning to create your mission statement. Next slide, we're going to transition into talking about goals and objectives. The goals and objectives that you include in your strategic plan should align with your mission and vision statements. Important that they all look like they come from the same place. They indicate how your organization is going to be successful in the future. The goals that you choose also should be measurable and include a time frame. For example, your goal may be to expand your target business base by reaching a new demographic by the end of the year. To measure this, you could measure who your current clients are. Then through the year, you can measure and track new clients or new targets that you bring onto your target list and see how you're progressing against that goal and objective. When you're creating goals and objectives, remember to be realistic. Do not be overly ambitious. Be aggressive, but don't be overly ambitious. While realistic stretch goals can inspire your team for better performance, if you pick a goal or objective that's totally impossible to achieve, it might leave you, it might leave your staff team and your constituents a little bit discouraged at the end of the day. Here are some top reasons that research tells us that strategy implementation fails. Unclear objectives, lack of buy-in from your staff team, from your board, from your leadership, from your constituents, loss of momentum. And again, that tells you it's important to be very realistic in setting your goals and objectives, and failure to celebrate success. You need to be absolutely sure that when you do achieve a goal, or you achieve a part of a goal, or maybe even more importantly, if you exceed a goal, that you celebrate that with your constituents, with your leadership, with your board, and certainly, very importantly, your staff team. The next section that I'm going to move to is the next slide, and this is probably, in my experience, what I consider the most important. This is where we actually accomplish something. The action plan. These are statements that tell you exactly the steps to take and what to do, or the tactics, in other words, of achieving a specific goal and objective. Action plans help keep you, your staff, your volunteer leaders accountable to achieving the goals and objectives that you've set out in your strategic plan. Your action plans or tactics can be broad or can contain specific details. It depends on the goal or the objective that the action plan supports. In the example that we talked about in the earlier slide about expanding your target industry base by reaching a new demographic, your action plan may include specific details on marketing plan to reach these new sectors. The marketing plan could explain the type of advertising you would pursue, print, digital, etc., how large your budget is. It may talk about trade shows that you would go to. It may talk about call trips that you make. It may talk about social media elements that help achieve that specific goal. You can also create an action plan for specific areas of your organization that demonstrate how actions will contribute to the overall success of your effort. When you and your team look at action plans in your strategic plan, you and they should be able to quickly understand how the organization or each person in the organization will achieve the stated goals and objectives. If your action plan includes deliverables, you should be able to see what needs to be done, when it needs to be completed by, and who is responsible for doing that. Another thing that I've found to be real important is your reporting mechanism. Create a dashboard of these action items or these tactics so that you can follow, so that your staff can follow, and so that your leadership and your board can see that you're achieving some success or exceeding success in developing these action plans. The next part of this presentation, I'm going to turn over to my good friend and colleague, Bill Murphy, who has developed, through Tulsa's Future, has developed kind of an alternative or maybe a little bit of redesign to their strategic plan to be considered as we go through and we emerge from this pandemic that we are experiencing across the country. So, Bill?
Great, thanks, Jim. I really appreciate that. So Jim has provided you a really solid foundation of strategic planning. I'm going to take a little different turn on this and talk about how we here in Tulsa have had to reassess our work in light of the pandemic, the economic downturn, and the uncertainty that we see over the next several months and years for our economy. I'd like to start by, even if you have a well-researched plan, like our Tulsa's Future program, things can and often do change. This was probably a much bigger change than I think any of us would have ever anticipated, but it reflects nonetheless and really speaks to the need to really have some flexibility in how you execute your strategic plan. As I mentioned, Tulsa's Future is our region's economic development plan. It began in 2006. It really began as a private sector response to the significant economic challenges that Tulsa faced. Tulsa in the early 2000s, much like the rest of the country, was dealing with the effects of the dot-com bust, the significant impacts to our aviation industry. We've got a big maintenance, repair, and overhaul facility for American Airlines, so the terrorist attacks had a pretty sizable impact on our community. And then we also had the energy industry really moving many of our headquarters to Houston, which really combined to create a perfect storm for a community that had not really invested time in creating a strategic plan. So these private sector folks came together to create this Tulsa's Future plan and really began a process of preparing our community for better economic times. Let's fast forward to 2011. After our 5-year strategy was complete, Tulsa was preparing to launch its second iteration of Tulsa's Future. But we had to pause because of an oil price decline. It was a decline of about 25%. Oil dropped, WTI dropped from about $100 a barrel to just under $75 a barrel in a very short period of time. So we took a pause and did not resume our next strategic plan until the following year. That would have been our Tulsa's Future 2 program. Now let's fast forward to 2019. We've just completed our Tulsa's Future 4 plan, which would have taken us from 2021 through 2025. So we had no idea what we were in store for after we completed that plan in late December. The pandemic and the resulting business shutdown forced us really to shelve the idea to move forward with a 5-year strategy that was going to have us out in the community trying to raise $19 million for our next 5-year strategy. And what made it worse for Tulsa is that oil prices again were hit very hard. And while we thought the 25% decline in oil was significant back in 2011, we saw really a collapse of the oil markets. There's no better way to describe that. WTI dropped more than 75% before rebounding to, I think today it's trading around $32.50 a barrel. But that's still about 40% below its 1-year high, and it represents a price point that impacts our energy companies, really their profitability. So that really then necessitated that we embark on this 3-pronged strategy, which you see depicted here on this slide, to react to our new economic outlook. We needed to respond, we needed to reinvent, and then we needed to reassess. So if we can go to the next slide. First and foremost, obviously, we had to respond to the immediate needs of our regional businesses. That meant that we needed to coordinate our outreach with our chamber membership team. They were making calls to our members and getting firsthand information of the challenges that our businesses had. We had to continue to leverage the advocacy work that our government affairs team has done for our chamber for years, but really through the lens of economic resiliency. Thirdly, and as a regional economic development group, we had to figure out how we could capitalize on the relationships, information, and resources that our regional partners brought to the table. We were impacted like most other organizations. We had to reduce the amount of resources that we had to work with, and therefore we had to really think about how we leveraged these relationships, both with our internal partners here at the chamber, but also externally with our regional partners, many of whom were reaching out to their own businesses and hearing some of the same information, but also sharing information that we were able then to incorporate with our other regional partners. So let's go to the next slide. So after we kind of responded to the immediate needs of our businesses, we also understood that we had to reinvent how we did our work. First and foremost, we recognized that we needed to align our staff resources, which, by the way, were reduced about 50%. We had to align those resources to support virtual operations, much like I'm sure most of you have done. That involves more Zoom meetings than I ever thought I would participate in my life. It meant that we also had to deploy best-in-class online resources. We were in the midst of deploying a new website, but then we also looked at other tools and resources that could help not only our businesses, but again, our regional partners, who really are our frontline defense with our local businesses and helping them get the resources and help they need to weather this storm. And then lastly, we really needed to find ways to engage our key partners. Again, both those in our region and our partners like site consultants through virtual interactions. Again, many of you may have participated in a wide variety, including those here at SEDC, engagements with site consultants and other corporate location decision makers. Let's go to the next slide. Last, but certainly not least, we recognized that our strategy needed to be reassessed in light of the significant challenges that we face in the short and, more importantly, in the long term. That meant, quite frankly, that we needed to reevaluate our Tulsa's Futures 4 strategic plan. It meant that we had to also review and expand those virtual resources. While we've deployed several that we believe are helping our businesses in a time when we're unable to meet with them personally, we know that there's other tools out there that we need to be researching and ultimately deploying if we're going to continue to be a best-in-class organization. And then finally, looking to convene long-term planning committees to assess target industries. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the reassessment piece, the reassessment of our strategic plan, because I think that really speaks to the flexibility that sometimes I think we lose in preparing these kinds of plans. When we saw the writing on the wall with the challenges that we face, from the business downturn to the collapse of oil prices, we knew that we needed to reassess this plan, and that was a decision that I did not enter into lightly. After all, we had spent more than a year getting the Tulsa's Future 4 strategy in place, and we had invested significantly with a consultant. And the time and energy, quite frankly, of our staff and key volunteers. But there were 4 major reasons that I felt that we needed to embark on this reassessment. First and foremost, as we've talked about, just the magnitude of this economic downturn. It's really unlike anything we've seen in our lifetime. Many of you may have weathered the 2008 financial crisis and the Great Recession. You know, that pales, quite frankly, in comparison to the 38.6 million people nationally who have filed for jobless claims over the last 8 weeks. We've seen major disruptions in the supply chain, and as I mentioned before, that steep decline in the oil markets. And while you hear probably a variety of perspectives on what we anticipate coming with the recovery, I contend that this what I like to call the great pause, they're going to be massive. We're going to have continued social distancing for more of us working at home, the decline of travel and air travel specifically, but travel in general. And I really think that we're looking at probably the greatest rethinking of our economy since the Great Depression. You know, here in Tulsa, we're also very sensitive to the oil price challenges that we're facing. Talking with some of our local and regional economists, many of them don't see us returning to $50 a barrel WTI until 2028. That could result in the additional loss of 10 to 20,000 more jobs here in the state of Oklahoma. That's on top of the 10,000 that we've lost since 2018, 2019, and the decline of oil during that time. You know, if that wasn't bad enough, with the collapse of air travel, as I mentioned to you before, we have a large American Airlines maintenance, repair, and overhaul facility here. We were facing some significant challenges even before air travel really collapsed. We were dealing with the 737 MAX issues, which were playing out in the supply chain, which affected many of our aerospace companies here in Tulsa. And then last, but certainly not least, tourism. It plays a huge role here in Tulsa, and it's going to continue to struggle as, you know, these venues, both large and small, are going to continue to fight for survival as uncertainty continues for the foreseeable future. Secondly, you know, first we had the magnitude of the downturn. Secondly, this impact to small businesses was really probably the most difficult piece of this economic downturn. And really there was an absence in our strategic plan that we recognized could not happen moving forward. We needed to get our small businesses and our small business strategies reconnected to our strategic plan. You know, and if pandemic and collapse of oil markets wasn't enough, we also needed to address the addition of some new players to our economic development work. You know, when we launched this plan, we did not adequately anticipate the findings and recommendations of some work that was being done on behalf of our Tulsa Innovations Lab. They're a Tulsa-focused, innovation-focused entity that was stood up late last year. They engaged McKinsey. Many of you may know McKinsey is probably one of the preeminent research institutions in the world. They came in and really looked at our innovation ecosystem and made some significant recommendations on that front that weren't part of our plan. Finally, I would contend that the talent and workforce environment that we had laid out in our strategy had been turned upside down. You know, our talent and workforce conversations went from one focused on talent retention and attraction to one focused on massive spike in unemployment, and really for us, the real possibility of flight of high wage energy and aerospace jobs from our region. And that was an additional element that we felt needed to be addressed as part of our new strategy. We recognize that we must take the economic recovery lessons from places like Pittsburgh and the steel downturn, Detroit and the automotive collapse, and really what happened in the South with textiles. But we also needed to look at disaster recovery lessons from places like New Orleans and Puerto Rico to develop best practices on retraining, and population exodus mitigation strategies. So I say all of that to say we're now going through a 6-step process to revamp our plan. First, as I mentioned earlier, is really just to assess the key needs for economic recovery here in the Tulsa region, figuring out what steps and what investments we need to be thinking about to get our businesses positioned for future growth. Step 2 is really profiling how the chamber redefines its role in regional economic development. Thirdly, we need to test some potential solutions and see how they play out and what make sense for us long term. Our fourth step really is to really take all of that information and then build a consensus around kind of this renewed vision for our Tulsa's Future initiative. And that really culminates in assessing the chamber's role in recovery and realigning our chamber mission around new priorities. Lastly, that means we're going to have to revisit the plan and rewrite it and reflect these new realities. So I apologize, I skipped ahead to my slide. I'm glad Matthew caught that. But I will tell you, what seems like a very logical sequence of thinking on why we needed to reassess our strategic plan. I will tell you it was not cut and dry with our volunteers, many of whom felt that there was going to be a V recovery that simply required us to wait out 2 or 3 months of downturn that we would then see an immediate recovery in our local businesses. And I think what we've seen for the most part is that recovery is not going to be V-shaped, that it is going to be longer term. Whether that turns out to be U-shaped or more of a swoosh, the time will tell. But I think we understood as an economic development organization that we needed to prepare for the worst so that we could be best prepared to help our businesses recover in this effort. So that's really all I have for my presentation. Again, Jim gave you a great overview of why strategic planning is important. I hope I've given you some reasons why you need to build in flexibility to your strategies, because while I hope the next challenge to your strategic plan isn't another pandemic or economic pause, there certainly will be events in your communities that challenge you to rethink how you do things. And I hope I've given you a couple of ideas on ways you can do that.
Bill, we have a couple of questions there for you. If you want to pull those up at the bottom there and take a look at it.
Give me just a second here. Okay.
Can you see it?
Yeah, so I see Jenna Dyke said, Bill mentioned Tulsa identified that they had a gap for small businesses and needed to add this to their strategy. Were these brought in under the chamber or the EDO? It's a great question. Many of you may work in communities where the chamber and the EDO operate separately. Here in Tulsa, we actually have a chamber that encompasses not only traditional chamber work, but also our economic development work through a regional economic development program called Tulsa's Future, but also our Visit Tulsa, which is our regional tourism work. So we're fortunate that we bring all of those efforts under one roof, so that then we're able to leverage the work, for example, of our membership and resource development team to carry out some of the economic development tools that we can bring to bear to help small businesses be effective. We initially had not included small businesses because we were looking at how we best deployed the tools that we had at our disposal. Prior to the pandemic, we made the move of small business out of our economic development division, our Tulsa's Future, into our chamber work, because we felt that it was more aligned with some of the work that membership was doing, some of the business to business networking, the business connections that they made more sense. But what we found through this downturn is that we simply need to put a lot more resources to help our small businesses recover. Yeah, and I think Jana just asks a kind of a follow-up question there, and it was just, you know, if our organization, how did we implement this when the mission is typically focused on more industrial development versus small business? And that really goes back to our Tulsa's Future 3 program, which encompasses 5 years from 2016 to 2020, really had 4 pillars. One focused on traditional economic business development work, one focused on talent and workforce, a third focused on small business and entrepreneurship, and a fourth focused on really quality of life, quality of place. When we started our Tulsa's Future program, the pendulum was way over on this side of, we've got to do something about job losses, and it was all about jobs. That has increasingly moved over until Tulsa's Future 3, when we had this much more holistic plan that addressed, you know, probably everything under the sun as it relates to economic development. And what we recognized was we weren't going to be as effective if we had such a broad focus. And so we brought that work back towards the middle and tried to identify those key elements, business development, marketing, workforce and talent attraction, as really our key focus. It wasn't really until this pandemic happened that we really rethought that strategy and really felt that we needed to bring back in small business as part of our strategy.
Jim, this is Gene. I've got a question for you. Matthew, if you want to pull him up there, and I'll start mine as well. There he goes. Jim, you know, in thinking about how EDOs and chambers might approach strategic planning, if someone were to hire you now, how would you approach the process differently today than you would have maybe a year ago?
That's a great question, Gene, and you know, the answer would be yes and yes. Obviously, before the current crisis that we're in, you know, maybe one of the elements that you would think about is possible major economic changes, like some that Bill described, that you have to make as you go through your 5-year plan or your 3-year plan or whatever your term is. But I think the pandemic has made us really think. I mean, just look at the example that Bill gave. I mean, it was from 0 to 10. It wasn't a little hiccup in the economy. It was, I mean, it was like scrapping the economy and completely putting a new one in front of you. And so, as a consultant and as a professional economic developer, I think going forward in strategic planning, we've got to maybe do a little more research and maybe have a little better understanding, or maybe do some better forecasting of where we think things might go. I think another phenomenon that we're going to see is, Gene, you and I'm going to give away our age now. You and I remember when we were doing 20-year plans, and we don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
You know, it went to 10, it went to 7, it went to 5. And the last few clients I've worked with have actually done 3-year plans. And I think because our world and our economy and our businesses are moving at such a rate now, that not only do you have to do that research, gather demographics, and do that forecasting, but there's a fear of reaching too far out in your projections for completion of your strategic plan. So I think you're going to see those shorten as we move forward.
Great. So any other questions from anybody? You got just a moment there if you want to pull in a question for Jim or for Bill. While they're thinking, Bill, I've got one for you. If you could back up like 2 months, what would you do differently in all this process?
Wow, Gene. I would buy stock in Zoom.
Isn't that the truth? Yeah.
No, in all seriousness, no, what I think I would have done is really tried to better align our virtual resources. I think, you know, that was probably one area. As you know, our business is a people business. I was looking at some of the attendees on there. I saw my friend from Georgia, Pat Topping. I saw our friends from Hot Springs, Arkansas on there. And, you know, it's about us being able to talk with one another, learn best practices, talk with our consultants, friend, grab a beer, you know, visit each other's communities. And we couldn't do that. And so, you know, from a kind of a personal interaction-based profession, we had not given much thought to getting those resources available virtually. Now, you know, fortunately, there are a lot of forward-thinking people out there, consultants, service providers who've been thinking about this very issue. And so, you know, we didn't have to start from scratch. There were a number of companies out there that had those resources. I think it just forced us to deploy them more quickly and earlier than we probably would have done. So 2 months ago, I would have had our new website completed. I would have had some online tools available immediately so that we weren't really trying to deploy those elements at the same time we were trying to respond to the immediate needs of our businesses to secure PPE or secure funding to keep their employees paid.
Absolutely. Well, like so many of us, I'm on the Zoom calls a lot. And in my industry with associations, we communicate with other salespeople, like with convention and visitors bureaus and hotels. And on their side, from a sales standpoint, which most of our economic development folks are on the sales side, so to speak, a lot of people are seeing that this technology can be used very effectively to get themselves out to a lot more people. And while it's not the face-to-face like we're used to, it can be a pretty decent alternative for us.
Yeah, and I'll add one thing. This move to virtual interactions, in particular with my staff, has really given me much more exposure and much more interactions with my staff than I probably would have had otherwise. And I think that's really been one of the unintended benefits of going virtually. You know, we get together every day, every afternoon to talk about projects that we're working on. Our Thursday afternoons are our happy hour, gives us a time to unwind, and it really has given us an opportunity, I think, to work more closely and frankly to be more effective because, you know, we're interacting more deliberately than we were in the past.
I agree. Well, I don't see any more questions at the bottom, so we'll sign off. But Bill, you and Jim, thank you very much for your comments today. We certainly appreciate your knowledge and information sharing with the rest of the folks. We had around 60, right at 60 folks that were on, so that's a great number. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you, Gene.
Everybody have a good rest of the day.